And upon seeing the popularity of the new VCR board games, Pressman Toys decided to jump in head first, and in 1986 released their first VCR board game, which was Doorways to Adventure! Oh boy, how exciting. With a name like that, this has no other choice but to be really good. Well, not exactly. Yeah, this isn't exactly what you'd think it would be. The videotape contains a bunch of stock footage from old adventure movies that are pretty much public domain. And it's more of a card game than it is a board game. And the objective of the game is not what you think it would be either. You see, the point of the game is to bid on certain artifacts that show up in certain scenes of the videotape. And the player who has the most successful bids by the end of the videotape is the winner. So it's an adventure game that has you bid on stuff? That's kind of weird. That's more like an auctioneering game, I guess. Hell, it should be called Doorways to Auctioneering! I mean, you kind of feel bad for this game because I think Pressman was actually really trying to make something interesting, but it just didn't work out all that well. But if you wanted to find out for yourself, you could find one of these brand new and sealed for $16. Wow, it's selling for cheaper than when it first came out. Okay, I'm gonna cut Pressman some slack here. It was a new thing. They weren't really sure what they were doing, but they went ahead with it anyway. They tried, it just didn't work. Doorways to Adventure was their first attempt at the VCR board game, and it wasn't very good, but surely their second attempt at the VCR board game would be awesome, right? Well, we would find out with Doorways to Horror! Which was also released in 1986, and like Doorways to Adventure, sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. Because really, if you were to look up disappointment in the dictionary, you would find a picture of this game. This, too, acts primarily as a card game as opposed to a board game. The video cassette is seemingly pointless, as it mainly and mostly acts only as a timer. And at times, the players moves as they once again bid on stuff. Only this time, instead of artifacts, you're bidding on monsters. What is going on with Pressman and bidding? I don't really understand. I would totally get it if the game was about auctioning off livestock, but it's not. It's Doorways to Horror. It's supposed to be about monsters. Why is there bidding involved? And as you play this game, you sort of get the feeling that Pressman has no idea what they're doing. In fact, their first attempt at the VCR board game, which wasn't all that good, is better than this one. But the packaging looks pretty cool. However, it looks better on the store shelf, where it should have stayed. So, Pressman's first two contributions to the VCR board game world weren't all that good, but all would not be lost for Pressman Toys, as 1986 would also see them release the Three Stooges VCR game, and this was a hit, proving that you really can't go wrong with the Three Stooges, unless, of course, it's the stuff with Joe. But other than that, if you put the Three Stooges in your product, you're gonna have some success. Hell, even the Nintendo game, as shitty as it is still pretty damn entertaining, and the Three Stooges VCR game is a shit ton of fun. Though, once again, it is more of a card game than it is a board game, but the premise is pretty solid. Basically, the players get cards, and you watch the tape, and every time one of the words that corresponds with one of your cards shows up on screen, you throw it down. The object is to have the least amount of cards at the end of the tape. The player with the lowest score wins. It's a pretty fun concept. The tape has a shitload of Three Stooges footage, and guess what? There's no bidding. And I know I've been giving Pressman Toys a pretty hard time about the whole bidding thing. It's just pretty odd to me, and I suppose it must be pretty hard to come up with a concept for a VCR board game. And I guess the whole bidding thing is a neat way to involve the videotape, therefore justifying the entire concept of the VCR board game, because you do gotta watch the videotape or else none of it means anything. So yeah, the whole bidding aspect is a good idea to an extent, and it is a rather interesting concept. It just didn't hold water nor did it work very well. But just because something didn't work doesn't mean it wasn't a good idea. So Pressman Toys ended up releasing a trilogy of VCR board games in 1986. So as the 1990s rolled in and the 20th century was slowly approaching its autumn, the VCR board game, which had been budding throughout the 1980s, had started to come into full bloom, and the games were starting to get more and more clever. Oh, somebody pulled the clever lever! And the game that would send the popularity of the VCR board game into the stratosphere was
Nightmare!
This was released in 1991, and not only is it the perfect example of a horror game, but also the perfect example of a VCR board game. Because really, when people think of VCR board games, they more than likely will think of this one first. I mean, come on, this has to be the most popular VCR board game. I mean, hell, it stands out by itself in its own category. And this game has a very expansive and involved story for a board game. The game takes place in what is known as the other side. And the players each take on the role of one of 5 characters: a werewolf, a vampire, a witch, a mummy, and a zombie. There really is more to it. I'm just giving a synopsis. Each of these characters has their own backstory. And this cadre of characters make up a group that is known as the Harbingers. And this group also includes the Gatekeeper, your host for this lovely little game. And the Gatekeeper, of course, is featured on the videotape, which primarily acts as a timer. And the Gatekeeper pretty much spends his time insulting you and prompting you into what to do next. The point of the game is to collect keys and make it to the center of the board, which is referred to as
the Nightmare Circle.
All the while trying to accomplish this before the tape ends, which is 60 minutes. And if you do this, you escape the other side. And if you do not, the Gatekeeper wins. It's a very well done game, well written, well conceived, and the whole concept is fascinating. And this game is the first installment of the Atmosphere series, which would continue to grow throughout the early 90s, and Nightmare would have a few sequels. There was Nightmare 2 from 1992, Nightmare 3 from 1993, and Nightmare 4, I bet you can't guess what year that's from. Yep, 94. And there was a 5th Nightmare that was set to be released in 95, but they dumped it because of declining sales. So I guess the charm of this game eventually wore off. But you know what? If they would have included the 3 Stooges, Nightmare 5 would have been made.
Watch the full episode here, as well as other classic Cat Nanos VHS pirate ship adventures. And please hit subscribe.